This conference will now be recorded.
Bueno.
Okay, folks, we'll get the show on the road. I'll talk to you with a sales pitch for about 30 minutes, and then we'll let Chris wrap up for 5 minutes. How's that for a deal? No, I won't be that bad, but I do want to welcome everybody to the John Wright speaker series tonight. Hey, Tim, come on in. Good to see your name coming up. I do have a bit of a sales pitch because there's a lot of new people coming in tonight because Chris is bringing in such a great rock fishing crowd. Bear with me. I want to announce that, the Severn River Association has been around for 110 years. We were founded in 1911 and we're still operating. And the goal of all through the years, the goal has been able to keep the Severn River into a fishable and swimmable river. We want more fish. We want more crabs, and we want more oysters in this river. To do that, we've adopted a variety of programs over the years. There's some restoration work, there's some shoreline work, but of late, the Severn River is concentrated on a couple of things. One of them is we have a robust water quality monitoring program, and we're monitoring 50 stations throughout the entire 14-mile river. First time that's ever been done. We do this weekly. We share all this data with the scientific, regulatory, and academic communities through a program called the Chesapeake Data Explorer. And the whole point of all this water quality monitoring is that we're trying to get a baseline of what we have today in the river. And so that we can tell in a few more years, oh, these little variations are a big deal or they're not a big deal. We don't know for sure yet. We have a lot of anecdotal information, which is what you fishermen seem to really love, is anecdotal. And the difference, what I'm getting at, is that all of our data is collected every week. We write it down and we publish it. So we don't have secrets. How many of you fishermen out there are posting, oh, I found my best rockfish at this coordinate in the river yesterday? I don't think fishermen do that as much. It's more of a, got to keep your spots to yourselves, I think. And I don't mean that badly. I think that's rather clever. That's what I would be doing. But the point is, we're out there and we're trying to figure out what's going on with our river. We just completed the state of the Severn River for 2020. Last year was a horrible river year. We had dead zones throughout the entire river and they lasted almost the entire summer. 2021 is a markedly improved river. So I hope that your fishing reflects this, but we've had some dead zone activity, but nowhere near the amount of dead zone that we had a year ago. So I think that's grand news, and we'll have all of this released, late spring when we compile all the data for our 2021 report card. Right now, the Severn River Association has 2 report cards, one for 2019 and one for 2020. They're available on our website, and believe me, you don't even have to go there, because in the wrap-up email I'll send out to you all, I'll send you a copy. The other thing we're doing is we're really promoting oyster restoration in the Severn River. Many of you all probably know that, because we have 5 areas in which we have active oyster reefs, and we see the crabbers there all the time. They know the secret that fishing on an oyster reef is particularly better than other spots. And we see a lot of fishermen as well out there, and our oyster reefs are between the 2 bridges in the Severn River. We have planted somewhere around 80 million oyster spat on shell in the last 4 or 5 years. So we're really committed to trying to bring back an oyster fishery. We want to have a sustainable population one day. It may take us a while. We think we need at least 1.3 billion oysters to get there, but we've got about 80 million now. We keep building up. We'll get a good fishery eventually. We're going to return this river back to normal. Another thing we have is we have a program called the Floating Classroom. This is a program in which we take students anywhere from the 4th grade to the 12th grade out on the river, and we give them a hands-on experience of how to collect water quality data, to understand what the point of doing this is. Then we're measuring oxygen levels and salinity levels, and we're looking at the bottom of the river. Now, fortunately, the salinity and the oxygen level for the oysters in the middle of the river is pretty good, They're surviving. They're growing fine. We've got 1-year-old oysters now that are about an inch or so long, which is that's about on par for where they should be. Last year we did the same, and we would take our students inside one of these creeks, and we would find dead zones, and the kids could figure that out instantly. So bottom fishing was not a good idea last year. But anyway, the floating classroom is available right now. It's available for free. We can take out up to 4 students and a parent or guardian at a time. We're wrapping up the 2021 season now. We're going to be relaunching this in 2022. So mark it down if you have some students who might want to get out there and learn about oysters, learn about fish, learn about underwater grasses, because we're also tracking the underwater grasses in the Severn River. And another key component what the Severn River is all about is education. And one of the ways in which we impart information and share information is through what you're here. This is the John Wright Speaker Series. And these used to be monthly live meetings at a local pub in Annapolis, but due to COVID, everybody shut down for a while, and we're restarting it thanks to Bryan Gomes, who's moderating our sessions here. And it turns out virtual is not so bad. We've got 42 people already signed up, and I'm just stalling to get the 43rd person to come on in. We had over 100 RSVPs for this show tonight.
So it's 47.
All right, we made it.
Are you seeing the ticker?
Yeah, but yours is a quicker one than mine. I'm older. So anyway, I think we're about ready to go. It's almost 10 after 7. So that's enough of my sales pitch. I think I've delayed things long enough. So we'll turn it over to Bryan. Bryan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tom. All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Bryan Gomes. I am the chair for the John Wright Education Speaker Series that the Severn River Association puts on a regular basis, almost monthly. We take a few months off here and there. And wanted to let you know tonight is a real treat to be able to introduce our friend and Captain Chris Dollar. Captain Chris Dollar was an ardent conservationist. He's an outdoor columnist at our local capital and a fishing guide and outfitter. An all-around Chesapeake outdoorsman with more than 25 years experience in avoiding office work. Tonight, there's going to be an overview of the complicated status of our rockfish, aka striped bass, aka, if you're my uncle in New Hampshire, stripas, because it's wicked fa, go Red Sox. And we'll be including the recent Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission plan called Amendment 7 to rebuild the depressed rockfish stocks. So with that, before I turn it over to Chris, I'd like people to know that if you are interested in questions, to please use the chat, and I'm gonna start taking notes and pulling questions out of the chat because we have a lot of people expected on the call tonight. So as he is speaking, if you have questions, use that chat function in the, so that bar where it shows the number of people at 48 right now. To the right of that, there's a little text bubble. That is the chat feature, and it should say message to everyone, or you can send it specifically to me, Bryan Gomes. Okay, with that, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Captain Chris Dollar.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and as well as Bryan. You guys hit on a few things that are pretty close to my heart. I started my career as an educator, and I sort of morphed into outdoor writing. I spent 5 years in the classroom and then 3 in the field. And before I got in the field environmental education, I told Bill Burton, who was a friend of my father, I was like, I'm gonna write about the outdoors. I'm gonna go fishing. I'm gonna, go duck hunting and all this cool stuff, and I'm gonna write about it. And Burton, at the time, we were fishing off of Tolly's Point between Tolly's and Greenberry. He just looked at me and shook his head. He told me I was a fool, but he wasn't far wrong. And I have a little slide deck. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm gonna go through this. If you have some questions as we go along, I'll do my best to give you my take on it. So with that said, we'll go to the next slide. As most of you know, stripers, rockfish, as we call them here on the Chesapeake Bay, they're a a very important game fish, both in the Chesapeake and throughout the United States, in fact. Bryan, are we good? Everybody hear me okay?
I just muted myself, but yeah, the sound is good, and
Excellent.
you have the good slide.
Very good.
So as you were,
Right.
great.
Thank you. Just like to check. So if we're talking from a pure monetary standpoint, which some politicians and other leaders like to look at natural sources, it's hard to beat the value that a rockfish has, a striper has here in the Chesapeake and up and down the coast. In terms of being a cultural icon, well, that's pretty evident. Not only in Maryland, but a few other states, it is their state fish. And of course, in terms of the heritage, what it means to generations and families, hard to put a price tag on that. As most of you know, or many of you know, probably on this call, in the late 70s into early 80s, you had a tremendous population crash of stripers, led to a historic closure of the entire fishery for 5 years. And by the late 1990s, it was restored. And many of us herald, me included, you can go back to 1998, 1997 when I started writing, we heralded it as a great success story, right up there with the bald eagle and the osprey. And unfortunately, we found ourselves back in a not a great predicament, and many of us are wondering, are we on the rocks again? So right now, rockfish, stripers are overfished, and overfishing is occurring throughout its range. And what that means is in 2018, they did a stock assessment, and they figured out late for many of us biologists that something was woefully wrong with the fishery. We'd seen these signs a little bit earlier, several years earlier for some of us. So that kicked off in terms of the management plan. There's an organization called the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. I abbreviated here for, didn't want to take up too much space. They are in charge of the state waters from the coast to the 3-mile line for a myriad of fish, both forage fish and marquee species like stripers. And right now, in fact, tomorrow, I believe, Amendment 7 is the blueprint for rockfish. And it's not an overstatement to say the future of rockfish is riding on what we do next. Very quickly, as mentioned, the halcyon days, at least in my generation of rock fishing, were probably the early 2000s to about 2008. And then the warning lights started flashing, and it was pretty clear too many cow stripers were getting hammered from all sectors. More recently, last 3 or 4 years, we've seen this dead discard issue, particularly in our area, Upper Bay, as people call it, was really coming to the forefront. But we knew that we weren't practicing some of our best attempts at reviving fish, and we were definitely fishing when it was too hot, the water was too hot. Still, we need some better data to reflect what that actually means. And one thing that I've sort of seen over my 30 years or so is the efficacy of both the commercial side and the sport angler side in terms of how good we are at catching not only rockfish but myriad of the other species. And that is something I plug in there because if some of you go back, if you look at the fish finders, for example, that today, I mean, you can see every little nuance, every little nook and cranny of a structure. We didn't have, some of you may remember the paper. Lawrence had a little paper sounder, a little flash finder, and so it was a whole different world. And it wasn't that long ago. Poor recruitment, we learned last week, is another year of dismal reproduction for stripers. It's the 3rd straight year that we're below 5. I think the average for the last 3 years is 3, and the long-term average, where it's like, that's good, is almost 11.5. And again, this is a little editorializing, but in my opinion, we've taken these incremental steps. We've tried to sort of, well, let's try this, let's try that, and we just were, perhaps a little too late to stop the skid, and that's the position we find ourselves in. So we move on to Amendment 7. Right now we're in Amendment 6, and I was talking to a gentleman who, a fisheries biologist, been around for a long time, earlier, I guess it was yesterday, and he said, if we just were more conservative with Amendment 6, we wouldn't be in this mess. And there's not much to say, in regard to that. So Amendment 7 started out with 10 or 11 ideas, and they condensed it down to these 4: recreational release mortality, conservation equivalency, management triggers. Now, CCA Maryland has a great explanation of all of these things for the recreational angler, and there's some other resources out there as well. And number 3 is management triggers, and that means it's like, okay, we see the yellow flashing, but we're not quite to the red. It's just, again, my interpretation. It's like, are we seeing that yellow flashing light that we should be paying more attention and to scaling back the number of fish taken out of the system quick enough? So that's what number 3 addresses. Number 4 was sort of a late entry into Amendment 7, is protect the year class. That was a monster class, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that's really, these 4 are on the table when the members of the commission meet tomorrow. I believe it's tomorrow. A couple of highlights here. You can take a second to read these, and it's a little bit, perhaps for some of us, a little bit more, into how the sausage is made than this talk is designed to do, perhaps. But when we talk about release mortality, we know that, on the right there, I hope you guys can see that, right, Brian? Everybody sees that? You still with me?
Yeah, I'm muted. What?
No, I was just making sure that I've been rambling. I just want to, usually when I do these talks, there's an audience, so I can look at folks and I just want to make sure everybody is still with me.
Yep, audio's good, and we're seeing Amendment 7
Great.
Highlights for that slide with the picture of the fish in the net.
Good deal. So, like I enjoy talking fishing with people, but I'm used to doing it like a little bit more intimate level than this. But
Hollywood Squares is the same thing.
Sounds good. So when we talk about release mortality in the Upper Bay, for example, we see dead floating fish, and we know, there's a certain assumptions are being made about, well, where did those fish come from? Well, we don't know 100%. Did they come from a pound net? Did they come from an angler who was not following the law and using a J hook? And so Amendment 7 really needs to address that. They need to not only promote it, but they need to fund and educate anglers across the range of rockfish, these best practices. And then, of course, the last bullet there is increase access to this information. And I think Tom hit on this, which was great, is you see this, particularly in the last 20 years, this rise of river keepers and river organizations. They've taken it upon themselves to know what's going on in their own waterway. They want to know if there's a dead zone in the Severn River. They want to know, are these oysters growing? So that's, there's some equivalency there in terms of what anglers. I mean, we're chomping at the bit. We want to give our fisheries manager information, but we don't necessarily have the tools to do that. 2 is conservation equivalency, and that's a little bit of a, in my estimation, there's where the eel gets a little slippery. And it's been a cornerstone of the coastal plan and the coastal management of species for many, many years. Many of us believe that states should pay for the privilege when you overfish rockfish, for example. It's like, all right, well, if you want to go this route and you don't meet up with the amount of fish that you said you were going to save, then you need to pay for that in terms of the next year. That's something to think about, something to consider. Individual states can be very creative there's nothing stopping Maryland, for example, from being aggressive and forward thinking in terms of how we manage our rockfish stock. A sidebar to this, we are, and I think I touched on this a little bit, we are the majority of rockfish are spawned in the Chesapeake Bay. So that's great, but it also comes with a heavy responsibility, in my opinion. Management triggers. When you see those yellow lights flashing, when does the red kick in? When should it kick in? You know? And we need to know that these triggers work. I mean, if we have them on paper but they don't work on the water, I mean, there's really no value to that. And number 4 was actually put in very recently. I don't know what that P is, but that's meant my thumb maybe hitting something. That was the 8th largest class on record in Maryland. Scored a 24 on the Young of the Year Index, and the Young of the Year Index basically predicts, how many new fish will be recruited into the fishery. Many of us are like, shoulda, woulda, coulda, because if you go back 15 years or so to 2003, 2004, this class really would just be humming along. So here's a quick slide takes us back to where we are on the timeline. This has been, over a year since Amendment 7 was initiated. It's gone through the public information document. It was very clear by the comments from Maine all the way to North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, that recreational anglers said, save more fish, stop killing as many fish as we've been doing. So now we're kind of, if you look at the last couple last slides, they're reviewing these documents. Excuse me. My take is that this will be, it's such a big document that they're probably going to be, we're probably looking at maybe May, not February, where this gets released for another public round of comment. Excuse me. Rockfish face these challenges. We mentioned the low Young of the Year. We got to make sure there's enough menhaden and shad and other, alwi. And we've been fighting this for 50 years, at least. Habitat deficiencies, water quality, climate change is a new one. What are the impacts on migration and spawning grounds? We don't know. Those are questions worth asking. Excuse me. I can tell you this. They used to do a winter survey for rockfish out of Virginia Beach. Now it's for the last few years, run out of Ocean City. So those wintering rockfish that we used to fish on at the mouth of the Chesapeake and on the Virginia, North Carolina line maybe 10 years ago or so, they've moved north. So that tells you something. Here's this slide, obviously many of you probably have seen. It's the 2021 year of the index. And if you look really from going back to 2005, we see a lot of below average, and not just below average, but like way below average. That's something to really pay attention to. It's certainly, I'm not making the case that we're where we were from, say, the early 70s through the late 1980s. I mean, we just had terrible numbers, but to believe that that's not possible is just sort of laughing in the face of reality. One of the things that's tied to rockfish health is bunker, menhaden, and we just really need to rebuild those building blocks of the ecosystem. They do a lot for the Chesapeake other than provide food for the game fish that we pursue, everything from rockfish to speckled trout to red drum, some of the cobia, of course, but they also do things like filter some of this algae and some of this excess nutrients that we have in the Chesapeake. So that's, I think, I'm including this because that's integrally tied into how we rebuild the rockfish. We can't look at these species in isolation. I think Tom said earlier, the things that they're doing on the Severn River, which are, you know, really important. They're looking at water quality, looking at nutrient inputs. They're raising oysters. They're having these oyster reefs and building this habitat. So if you kind of look at everything independently, it doesn't tell you the full story. And of course, this is, you know, I've been involved in fisheries since about maybe 25 years almost, and you know, I can go back to some of my early columns about the importance of rockfish. And if you look at this slide, that was a 10-inch rockfish pulled out of a 28-inch rock. That was a 10-inch menhaden pulled out of a 28-inch rockfish's mouth. That thing was all the way down there, and we were throwing poppers. So we weren't live lining, we weren't dead sticking with bait or anything like that. We were throwing topwater plugs, and that rockfish was so hungry and so eager for anything to eat that it not only had a full gullet, but also didn't have any hesitation hitting my lure. We all know about, I shouldn't assume. Many of us know about omega protein, and it is the last industrialized operation on the entire East Coast, Reedville. The conflicts with anglers are pretty much a given every single year. Get too close to the cobia and the red drum anglers. I mean, I'm talking like, a cast throw on some examples. And what we really don't know is what is the bycatch issues. We haven't shined a light on that very closely. The industry will tell you, oh, we adhere to all the rules, but if rockfish and red drum and cobia are all feeding on schools of menhaden, logic dictates that they'll be where the menhaden schools are. And these last two, I just give you an example of this. You may have read about this in Hampton Roads. They call them fish spills. It's basically when the net gets hung up and they can't bring it on board, so they got to dump the net. And so the net is full. It's got tons of bunker in it. And so it was estimated in the Virginia Marine Fisheries Commission. They sent them a letter, a very pointed letter to Omega. It's like, you caught these fish, stop doing it. But it's kind of like when I was in 8th grade and got, kind of called out for being a smart aleck, it's like, well, Omega's kind of shrugs their shoulders like, well, yeah, it doesn't count against our bay cap. So what? We got to figure out a way to make that count against their cap, because then they'll be a little bit more aware of what they're doing. So very quickly, this is all going on this week at the AFMFC. And in my way of thinking, they're not in isolation. I might have mentioned that earlier. They're all tied together in terms of how we rebuild rockfish stocks is as much a part of how we look at the next steps for bunker management. We had some good wins in 2019, a lot of left to do, including fully implement these ecological reference points, which are basically looking at the ecosystem as a whole. And this is a great graphic because you just see the different aspects of it. You have loons, and you have tunas, and you have bluefish, and you have cobias, and you have all kinds of different things going on, and whales, and people watching the whales, and people fishing in the background. It's cartoonish, true, but it tells the story. And then the other 3 points are more specific to actual, specific actions we could do. Omega Protein, it is a company that will do whatever it takes to fill the hold. And I think in the 21st century, that is not the right approach, and hopefully we'll see some good steps in coming months. So what can folks who fish off of Tolly's Point or Greenberry or soak some bait off of the old 450 pier do? What can we do to rebuild rockfish? Well, we certainly can demand, and I think we're past the stage, and I'm not trying to be rude here, but where we're asking our fishery managers like, hey, it would be a good idea to do this, because that's just not cutting it anymore. We need to demand that they start putting these things that we're asking for. Particularly, the recreational community has been very clear what we want. We're willing to take less fish, many more less rockfish out of the water for more fish to catch. That's been the trend for at least 6 or 8 years, in my opinion. And so we need to be able to know how many fish are being taken from the system, what kind of impacts are we doing, for example, in the summer fishery. And that means getting involved. And the Severn River Association obviously is a great place to start. The Coastal Conservation Association is another group that I think does an excellent job. And then we can do our own little on the water stuff. It's like, all right, well, I might take 1 or 2 or 3 for the season. That's it. Even though the regulations say I can take 1 per day. On number 3, we need to get a little bit, and I say this as a guide. We need to be more equitable in how that works. It doesn't make sense to me, and this applies to bluefish as well, that you can, as a charter boat, you can take 2, but as a recreational angler, you can only take 1. I don't see, I don't understand the DNR, our Department of Natural Resources mindset that makes sense. And they know my position on that. I've said that many times. It doesn't equate in terms of a fairness and, more importantly, a conservation. So with that, I will happy to take any questions or answer some fishing related questions as well.
Thank you, Chris. Can you talk briefly about the bigger picture of the fishery in the Atlantic and where the fish congregate, where they go, where they spawn? Like, just talk about the kind of behind the scenes of,
Right.
We know what we see here in our bay, but talk about big picture of the striped bass fishery in the Atlantic and where they go and what they do.
I can happy to try, and I'll be quick because that's a huge question. The Chesapeake, as I think I mentioned earlier, is the nursery ground, and it always has been. So depending on which survey you're looking at, it's anywhere as low as 65%, anywhere as high as 85% of the total production for all of the rockfish on the East Coast. So we have a special place here on the Chesapeake, and the rockfish are a special fish. There are state fish. They're what drives the charter boat and the guide industry. And so these fish will spawn here in the there are 4 major tributaries in Maryland, at least. They're Choptank, the Nanticoke, the Potomac, as well as the Upper Bay, and that includes Bohemia, Lake Sassafras. So those fish will come in here late February, March, and then they'll spawn. And those fry will go up into the estuaries to hopefully grow up and get bigger fish. And that again, that's a key element to what we've been talking about here, because you can't have small fish without big fish. As a temperate bass, stripers spend most of their time in the ocean. So they'll go up the coast. This is historically now. They'll go up the coast and they'll go past New Jersey and then all the way up to New England states. And of course, their range goes all the way into Canadian waters. But really, they'll make that reverse. Historically, or at least the last 30 years, they'll make that historic reverse migration, and we really had a lot of fun with those fish. Now, the big question, Bryan, is what do warming ocean waters, changes in forage and bait, changes in water quality in historic spawning grounds, what is that doing to our rockfish now? We've seen some changes anecdotally, and scientists and biologists are working on that. But they're really kind of an amazing long-lived fish. 30 years, it's possible. They can get over 100 pounds. To get a 50-pounder is kind of the badge of honor for that. And that is, I think, and they've been around as long in terms of the history of the country, as long as the country's been, a kernel of an idea, frankly. Even you see it all in the historical records. You see it in the stories, and from the first colonial settlements and way back before that to the native people. So they're just a special fish that has a special place in the Chesapeake lure for sure.
Great, thank you. Another question I have here in the chat is saying, and this goes back to you talking about, commercial versus recreation and the different harvesting. Question is, what are the estimates for the proportion of fish taken by recreational fishermen versus commercial?
Right. So I don't have the exact numbers, but you would understand, it makes sense that there are more recreational anglers than there are commercial anglers. So we take many more fish than the commercials. The problem is, or the concern is what the commercials are, what class and what size fish are they taking? So that's something that we're working through, and frankly, we need to cut the commercial quota at least for the short term, if not, make that a staple, frankly, because these larger cows that you're taking, you're talking millions of potential eggs, and obviously not every single egg is going to develop into a fry and develop into a rockfish that reproduces. But I'm a little wary making it a us versus them argument, recreational versus commercial, because I think at the end of the day, everyone needs to, we need to recognize we cannot keep taking as many fish out of the ocean and out of the Chesapeake as we are. It's just as simple as that. I mean, it's, in my way of thinking, and that means you're going to have to, if you rely on the fish as a charter boat or a guide or a commercial netter, you're going to have to adjust your business model. It's just, if that's your perspective on it, and that's just where we are today in 2021.
Do you have a rough proportion idea of what the take is from commercial versus recreational folks? Like if you had to do a percentage guesstimate?
Right. Depends, because you would have to figure in, I don't. The answer is I don't, because you would have to look, are you talking in totality, you're going all the way up to Maine and Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a hook and line fishery. Virginia has a gill net fishery in the wintertime. So I'm not trying to avoid the question, but it's pretty, it would probably be at least 3 to 1 recreational.
Got it.
Oh, I got a question, Chris.
Oh no, cut his mic off.
Uh-oh.
Dr. Lewis, how are you?
Hey, Chris, I'm kind of curious. What's the story on trophy season? Did I remember correctly? Virginia had canceled theirs, and what's the relationship between Rockfish and Virginia and Maryland?
Right, that's a good question. So I'll answer it this way. Maryland, if you go back, Maryland is not historically a trophy rockfish state. It just isn't. That's not the fish we grow. And again, my opinion, when they opened the moratorium in 1990, we saw rockfish come back. It was awesome. It was great. And then we saw tournaments, and who can catch the biggest fish for $20,000. Virginia did not really have that season, but they did recently cancel their trophy season. Now, there's a good argument to be made. Well, that was a paper cut. In other words, it didn't really show up on the ledger board because they really haven't had any fish over the last 5 years, if you follow what I'm saying. So this concept of a trophy fishery in the Chesapeake, in the long history of stripers, is a fairly new thing. And I certainly participated in the 2000s down at the Bridge Tunnel, where and on the Susquehanna Flats, where the prospects of catching a trophy rockfish, which most people put at 40 inches or and above, that's where I put it. That was the exception. It wasn't the norm. I mean, most of those fish we were catching down at the Bridge Tunnel, or at least for me, maybe I'm not that good of a fisherman, and up on the flats, were were males in the 25 to 32, 33 with the, once in a blue moon for me, you catch this, really beautiful fish. So I think that, I answered your question a little different way. I think Virginia, and I applauded them for doing that, the closure, but I think it was easy for them to do that in a sense because there's so many, there's so many more options for Virginia anglers, and two, probably should be one, there weren't any stripers to catch in any quantities. That fishery had pretty much dissipated.
Wait a minute. I'm not a fisherman, but are you saying that Virginia fished all their fish and that's why they can't have a trophy season, but Maryland continues to have a trophy season because we have fish?
Yeah, that sounds like a trick question, but I'll answer it a different way.
Well, I do my fishing at Safeway. I got to admit, guys, it's just so much easier.
Well, I tell you what,
but
you're
that's
smart
what it sounds like.
It's a lot cheaper. Maryland faces some, and I understand it, faces some economically hard choices to make. I get it. I don't agree with it, but I get why they've in recent years they've made the decision to keep the striped bass trophy season. Now they did cut it from 3-4 weeks down to 2 weeks, and there's a lot of us who are like, all right, well, we need to look at the striper fishery in a completely different way. Look at me. I'm sitting, in a room talking to a green light. I can't really see any of you all. I can't get a visceral connection to you. And so we've made adjustments in terms of how we communicate with each other. And so if we have to do that, then and we have a striped bass fishery that's overfished and experienced overfishing, how can you justify continuing to take more and more fish out of that fishery? It just doesn't make any sense to me. And it's not the same. It's not, when I talk to folks older than me, and I'm not young, but I talk to folks older than me, it's like, yeah, but what were you knew these waters like nobody's business. You didn't have super sophisticated sonar. You didn't have boats that could go 50 miles an hour and could rack up 100 miles, in a day. I talked to somebody earlier today. They told me they went 87 miles round trip from where they left in the mid-bay, Patuxent region, and they had 13, 14 rockfish to show for it, and none broke. Sorry, 3 broke 18, and none broke the legal limit of 19. So, I mean, that tells me, and anecdotally, I can't find fish in little spots where I used to be able to find fish. And to me, that when that was happening 5, maybe 6 years ago, I was like, uh-oh, this is not good. So, yeah, the trophy season to me, I think that's not where we should be at. If that answers your question.
Thanks. Yes, Tom? Okay, I have a question in the chat here, a comment and then a question. I fully support catch and release for rockfish and other game fish. I get frustrated when I see other anglers not handling the fish gently and leaving the fish out of the water for an extended time. I frequently see photos on Facebook with fish being held vertically by their jaws for photos. Can you comment on how the fishing community can improve handling and release practices for more anglers?
That's a great question. It is a human imperative to say I conquered this, I suppose, when it comes to fish. That is going to be a hard nut to crack.
So social media doesn't help the party.
Right. That's a whole nother meeting. Yep. But yes, so there are specific and provable catch and release methods, particularly when the waters get above 74, 75 degrees for striped bass. Leave them in the water. If you're going to take them out of the water, don't drag them by their jaw. Wet towel or a shallow landing rubberized net, they're all good. Right? I'm a big fan of leaving them in the water, and somebody, if you're possible, leave them, but literally the breath rule. When I was an outdoor environmental educator, was the breath rule. If I, can take 2 or 3 breaths, 20 seconds or so between breaths, put the fish back in the water. So education is going to be a big component, I think, on that as we make this transition from this what we have known as the striper fishery and what the striper fishery is actually going to look like in the next 10 to 20 years. And if it's not really worthy of taking a picture, don't do it. But I think, not to get too wild about answering this question, but I think people are looking for some joy, particularly in the pandemic, to hang on to. So on the other hand, I can appreciate you go out and you catch a nice fish. You never caught a fish before. I guess if you're going to hold that fish, make it that one fish that's going in the cooler. I guess that's what my suggestion would be. Otherwise, everything else should stay in the water. De-hookers, pliers, the whole bit.
Great. Another question I have, are there studies being done on stomach content of striped bass? Have they found plastics or microplastics?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Is there oversight for any bycatch for the commercial fishing industry?
Yes, but I'm gonna make a leap here. I guess the question relates to menhaden, perhaps, and the answer is no, not in any meaningful way. So we don't really know what they're hauling overboard in those nets. Anecdotally, we know. We've seen it. I've seen it personally. Schools of red drum and cobia feeding on bunker, and then the spotter planes come, and you look up and you're like, oh, here we go, and then the purse seiners come in. But we don't. You don't have a count of that, and so that is definitely an area where some more sunshine needs to be directed.
Got it. And then another question, what can individuals do to protect our waterways related to a healthy fishery?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it takes me back to my again, my educator days. It's everybody lives upstream and everybody lives downstream. So fertilize the simple stuff, the fertilizers, and you see this a little bit. I mean, I got neighbors here, and and on one side of the neighbor, you could putt on this green, and it's just like, I try to be nice, and I try to, hey, good morning, but it's like, why do you throw all this fertilizer on your lawn? And then literally the neighbor next to that neighbor has native plants and river birch and all kinds of good butterfly plants and bushes and all kinds of cool stuff. So the reckoning is here, both in terms of how we treat the planet and it kind of, not to get all preachy, but we got to take individual action to make a collective action.
Agreed.
Who planted that question? That's what I want to know. It's a fishing talk.
Seems that red drum, cobia, Spanish mackerel are more numerous in the bay than they've been in recent memory. Why do you think they're doing well while the striped bass are continuing to struggle?
So, couple of words for you. Commercial market. Red drum, no commercial market. Spanish mackerel, little commercial market. Cobia, yeah, there's a commercial market to some degree, but they're not a schooling fish. So they don't travel up the Chesapeake every winter and get netted off of Smith Point as they try to, or a Roaring Point or any of these places where they try to go spawn. So that's my answer. And I'm not necessarily saying that stripers need to be game fish, but we certainly need to treat them with more respect than we have in terms of their value as game fish and what they do, not only economically, which I've mentioned before, but also, from a cultural standpoint. So The other thing is, if you look at red drum, for example, we in Maryland, and both in Maryland and Virginia, there's slots. You can only keep fish that are, you know, I shouldn't say pre, but fish that aren't in that sweet spot of spawning. Whereas in rockfish, you know, at least in the last 20 years, 25 years, we haven't really done, we've done a terrible job of protecting those big breeders. And we had the opportunity in 2003 to be much more conservative than we are. We didn't, and now it's biting us in the butt, frankly. Spanish mackerel are one of those fish that are pretty fast growing. You know, they're and then of course the other, it might be also perception. Folks have figured out how to catch them. And then the third thing I'd add to that answer would be changes in their patterns. You know, they're coming further up in the bay, particularly cobia and red drum over the last, you know, half a dozen years or so. So, and people are very, anglers are very tuned into that. They'll figure out how to catch them if they can.
Hey, Chris, what's the story on, is there any big impact on the rockfish from the invasive species, you know, the snakehead and the blue cats? What's going on with them?
I would love to know. We do know this, right? I believe I'm correct that the Conowingo Dam stopped doing the fish ladder, or at least reduced the number of fish ladders, because they were concerned that snakeheads and blue cats were hitching a ride with the shad and herring to, you know, on their way to spawning ground. I've seen some studies, but I haven't seen any studies as it relates to or any interest, frankly, in are invasive species prevalent in these spawning grounds, and are they having an impact on that fry, on those small rockfish? I haven't seen anything, but it's a great question.
Well, how's the fishery just in general? They're going after snakeheads, tournaments, any chance that people can turn their attention to capturing those guys?
Excuse me. One more time.
Well, I was just curious, you know, the rockfish seems to be under a lot of pressure. If there's any way, is there any interest amongst you all fishermen in going after snakeheads as an alternative for a while?
Oh yeah. That not so much for the blue cats, because it's sort of, I don't want to say passive, but you know, they're bottom feeders and it's mainly a bait fishery. But with the snakeheads, it's an active fishery. So folks with bows, for example, top water, you know, casting, that is the snakehead fishery. So, but you know, these are fish that got a foothold in almost 20 years ago, and they've expanded. I mean, I saw a graphic not long ago that showed where they thought snakehead started from, which is Potomac, and where they think they are now. But you hit on a key point. I think diversity of your angling effort has to be part of the equation. Somebody mentioned something about catch and release. Well, you have to say, okay, it's 90 degrees out. Maybe I don't go rock fishing today. Maybe I do something else. Maybe I go crabbing for 6 hours in the morning or 4 hours in the morning. But that's, you know, I think diversifying your angling is part of that, and the invasive set in there, and you know, we need to knock them down for sure. But they've got a pretty strong foothold. Well,
I'm just curious from the group here, as you know, going after snakeheads is much fun or as interesting as rockhead. Maybe it isn't. Maybe they're just a trash fish nobody wants to play with. I don't know. I see a lot of
well, they're delicious.
Facebook. Sorry?
Yeah, they're top of the food chain. They're pan.
I said they are an apex predator when it comes to, you know, where they are, and they taste good. They fight hard. I mean, they check all the boxes as a game fish. And I remember, you know, not only, I don't know, 8 years ago, 6 years ago, I had this conversation with the then editor of Sport Fishing Magazine, and we were both like, why do people hate snakeheads so much? And they're awesome. They're just, you know, what's not to like? They'll just smash a topwater lure. They'll smash a frog. you can, the state says go after them with reckless abandon. You can fry them up, in House of Autry and enjoy yourself. And but yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's the look. I mean, they changed the name of the Chilean sea bass, didn't they, from dogfish to make that plate palatable. So what do I know?
Another question, Chris, you talked about their food chain and that they feed primarily on menhaden, bunker. Who feeds on striped bass? What's their mortality? Who's preying on them?
Not
besides us.
yeah, besides humans, I assume.
Yeah.
Right. So actually, larger rockfish will feed on they'll do some cannibalism. Other predators, sharks in the ocean, for example, will eat on them. Ospreys, of course, when they're young, fingerlings, they'll eat on them. But as soon as they kind of get that sweet spot, that 25 to 30 plus 35 inch, they're and they school, because they're still schooling at that point for the most part. They don't have a ton of natural predation, frankly.
Anyone else? I went through the questions in the chat. Anyone that did not put in chat but had a thought? We have a few minutes left here with Captain Chris Dollar. So if
How about a fishing question? Anybody want a fishing question? Doesn't anybody want to know the story of this last slide?
Tell us.
Yeah, man. It was a beat down of all beat downs. I fished 4 or 5 spots, and then we came upon this spot and the tide hadn't moved an inch, and it finally started to move. And so this first cast was a bust, and then I moved off to this point. You can see, if you look hard right, you can see a little patch of quiet water. I cast maybe 10, 12 feet beyond that quiet water where it was a little ripply, dragged that top water lure and smack up. And so I think I have these slides reversed, but the fish in the end of that, or excuse me, in the beginning of this slide deck is the fish that I caught. This was the beginning of that sequence, and behind me was a friend of mine. I was on his boat, and we were on the eastern shore, just below the little chop tank, and all he was doing was heckling me the whole time. He's like, "You're not going to catch anything. Just give it up. Give it up. It's over." It's like, today's not our day. You name it. He just did constant berate, the fact that we just, one of those days didn't catch it. And so I caught it on one of the proverbial last cast, and we just, we had a little bet, little side bet, little beer and a sandwich side bet on it, and it just, I tell you, it's one of those moments. It's kind of like why I like to give talks like this. One of those moments is sort of like, you get out there in the wilds, you see the sunset, you see, there's a creature out there that's been swimming around for eons, and there's a love and respect for it. So, and that's kind of what, why I wade into these more technical waters. It's really not my nature, frankly, but it's something that's necessary. And so I appreciate, folks like the Severn River Association, everybody who took time out for the last hour to join us. But anyway, that's the story of that slide.
Great. We got one more question here. Someone mentioned that we've seen an uptick with dolphins in the Severn and other local rivers in recent years. Do dolphins follow rockfish or feed on rockfish?
Yeah, so they'll definitely eat them, but my understanding is they're primarily feeding on bunker and some of the some of the other shads type, alewives in the Chesapeake. But yeah, certainly, they're opportunistic hunters, so they'll eat a rockfish. But I mean, rockfish can swim pretty quick, and if you get a ball of bunker in front, and I've seen it. If you're a dolphin, you get a ball of bunker in front of you, and you get a rockfish that can swim faster, or a ball of bunker that just panics and sort of does the circular freeze. What are you going to pick? They're gonna go after the bunker or some of the other easier prey, but for sure. But they definitely eat them for sure. But I mean, not to the. I've seen some of the online stuff about the dolphins are eating all the rockfish in the bay. You'd have to prove that to me to say that that's the cause of, you know, the decline.
All right, I got two last questions here for you, and then we'll shut this down. Question is there any talk of shutting down the season in Maryland until September to prevent summer mortality issues?
The entire season, I assume the question is?
Is there any talk of shutting down the season in Maryland until September to prevent summer
Oh,
mortality?
until September, sorry. Yeah.
Or maybe you take the summer off and you have a spring and fall.
Yeah, right. There's talk of taking the summer months off, 2 months, you know, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, etc. But there's not going to happen under the current DNR regime that we're working with. Just, you know, we're looking at 20, you know, the next change of administration before we see any kind of different attitude about the seasons, frankly.
Got it. And then someone wanted to know, pickerel disappearing in November 2016 and then reappearing in 2020, if you have any insight into the ebb and flow of the pickerel fishery.
Yeah. I can pretty much guess who asked this question, but yeah, I tell you, I cut my teeth thanks to a Severn River Association stalwart, John Page Williams. He let me launch my kayak in mid 1990s, and I wore out a raised pond. And I wore it out for 2 years, and I caught like pickerel. Nobody, I thought I was the world's greatest fisherman. I was catching pickerel left and right. The third season, it was slow, nothing. The fourth season, same deal. So I think you know, if you look at the life cycle of these pickerel, I think they're one of these fish that naturally their life cycle will go up and fluctuate. And they're tied directly to underwater grasses and things like that. So if you have a down year with underwater grasses in a particular river, there's a very good chance that those younger chain pickerel are you know, no place for them to hide. They can't get to bigger chain pickerel, and they're notorious cannibals. I mean, they'll eat their own, you know, at the dinner table, frankly. So that's my uneducated, authorized guess as to that. I've fished with chain pickerel for many years, and just when I think I have figured them out, you know, it's like, then that's just a head scratcher. So anybody who thinks they've figured them out, well, you ought to, you know, let me know what the deal is, because I love them to death, and they're great fish, and the Severn can be fantastic for it. Brewer's Pond, Ray's Pond, you know, Chase Creek, some of these other spots up there can be, you know, out of control. And that, you know, the next year it's like, where'd they all go? So,
Captain Chris, this is my last question, and I mean it. And thank you for being so gracious with your time.
yeah, happy to do it.
Can you give us some overarching like tips on fall rockfish topwater fishing for people that like to do that, or know that's a fun time of year to fish for them, and we don't have to worry about that summer mortality as much? Can you speak to that briefly?
So real quickly, definitely, if you're not going to keep fish, single hooks on your topwaters, or bend the barbs back, or clip them off for sure. Definitely have at least 3 different rigs ready to go. A paddle tail, maybe anywhere from, if you're fishing open water, anywhere from half to an ounce. A topwater is your second one, and then sort of a mid-level swimming plug, and then maybe you throw in a fourth, especially as we get into the later part of the month. You want a spoon of some sort. You want something, a fluttering spoon of that nature. Now, the last tip, you know, everybody knows where the bent rod radar, you know, you see everybody congregating. Take a moment, check it out. I mean, is that really what's going on? Are there good fish there, or is this just a, you know, smaller fish, lots of bird action, feeding on smaller anchovies or silver sides? Really, what you want to do is kind of take your time on that and not get overexcited, frankly, and just plow into the mix and have at it. I would take your time, and if you have those 4 rods rigged, pretty much going to cover all your bases for any fishing scenario in October and early November.
Good advice. Thank you. Well, with that, I would like to thank Captain Chris Dollar. We can have a round of applause, whether you're muted or not. And yes, this is all important information that we need to know, and we'll keep track of what the fishery does in these upcoming years, because it sounds like striped bass are in flux, and we need to appreciate these natural resources that we have the opportunity to catch, and maybe more catch and release is the way to go.
Absolutely. It's all hands on deck, man. We need everybody. So anything you can do, we appreciate it.
Great. And lastly, to our group members, our speaker next month is not 100% confirmed, but it looks like we'll be getting to hear from our representative from the Maryland Senate. So more on that in the week to come. I was hoping to have confirmation today, letting them know that we have our talks the third Tuesdays of each month. So stick around for that. So with that, people can sign off. If people want to stay on and catch up and chat and talk, you can unmute, but we'll let people go their ways and enjoy the rest of their Tuesday evenings. Thanks, Tom, and thank you, Chris.
All right. Y'all stay good. Be healthy.
Good night, y'all. Thanks a lot, Chris. Appreciate it. See you, Bryan.
You're gonna hit the stop, Tom?
I
Stop on the record.